Imagine a place where the ground has forgotten how to be soil. The wind does not arrive, it invades. Dunes move like slow animals, swallowing fences, footpaths, even the names of fields. Wells turn to rings of dust. Children learn to read the sky the way others read books, searching for clouds that almost never come. This is the Sahel, where the desert doesn't conquer with a roar, but with a whisper that never ends. For years, the world looked away. Reports were written, aid convoys came and went, and the map remained the same color of thirst. Then, in Burkina Faso, a small nation that most headlines skip, people did something so simple it sounded absurd. They buried what others throw away, rotting fish and dry straw. Not as a stunt, as a plan. A young president, Ibrahim Traoré, did not ask for faith in speeches. He asked for faith in shovels. Straw went down to slow the wind inside the earth. Fish waste followed to feed microbes with nitrogen and phosphorus. The pits were closed, the squares marked, and the people waded through heat that makes metal wince. When the short rains finally came, the sand did not shrug them off. It held. Patches of soil darkened like spilled ink. Earthworms returned like exiles allowed home. Tiny ponds flashed where only glare had lived. Saplings leaned into the wind and did not break. In villages that had grown fluent in silence, laughter sounded unfamiliar and therefore precious. Can straw and fish really stand against a desert that devours horizons? Is this a miracle with calluses, or just the desert's most convincing mirage? The only honest answer is also the hardest. Keep digging, keep planting, keep watching the soil for the one thing it has not given in years: a reason to believe. When the first trenches were marked with twine and stakes, the village laughed gently to be polite. The plan looked like a child's drawing on the face of a giant. Shallow furrows, no deeper than a forearm, cross-hatched the sand. Trucks arrived with the smell of a harbor that had forgotten the sea. Fish, waste scraped from reservoirs, heads and bones and viscera that once drew flies in silence. Other trucks came piled high with straw, light as a rumor, golden as a prayer, shed from fields that barely remembered their own harvests. For every hectare, 5 tons of this unlikely marriage, 1 part rot, 1 part stock, were lowered into the ground like a secret. There were rules. The straw went in layers to slow the wind within the earth itself. The fish waste was mixed with a whisper of ash to temper the burn and the stench. The pits were backfilled and pressed, then marked with stones so that even in a dust storm, a farmer could find the square he had trusted his future to. The first day, the ground smoked with smell. The second day, the smell thinned to a warning. The third day, it settled into the promise of work already begun. Under the surface, microbes discovered a feast. The fish waste offered nitrogen and phosphorus, a banquet for the invisible. The straw held on to rain the way a hand holds on to a friend you thought you'd lost. Together, they became a slow engine. Heat of decay, breath of bacteria, threads of fungus stitching sand to silt to crumb. Moisture stayed longer, and because it stayed, roots did too. It is not a glamorous chemistry, but it is a faithful one. Agronomists from the university in the capital arrived with augers and clipboards. They pulled cores and smiled in the way of people who are careful with joy. Water retention ticked up past 40% compared with nearby plots. Organic carbon climbed and kept climbing. And then came the earthworms, fat pink commas in a sentence the land was writing back to its people. "You see," an old man said, holding one up between his fingers, "the soil is learning to breathe again." By mid-season, the treated fields had a sound, a certainty you could hear. Wind in leaves that did not rattle like paper, rain landing on something that answered back. Maize stood shoulder high, then head high, then taller. Millet bowed with the weight of grain. Just beyond the boundary stone, stalks in untreated sand went brittle in a gesture the desert rehearses every year. The difference was not a matter of opinion. It was a line you could step across. Dust on one side, dinner on the other. Salif measured the change in sacks because that is how you measure a year when you farm. 10 sacks last season from this plot, 25 this season from the very same ground. He did not smile when he said it. He stood very still, as if a sudden movement might scare away his luck. Later, at market, he smiled like a man who had been carrying a heavy bag in his chest and had finally set it down. Awa measured the change in bowls. 1 bowl a day for her 3 children in the lean months, now porridge in the morning and stew at dusk. She did not count calories, she counted laughter. She bought exercise books and pencils with the extra grain and told the shopkeeper to wrap them in paper so they would look like gifts when she brought them home. That evening, her daughter wrote her name on the first line in a careful hand, and Awa watched as if the letters were seedlings she had watered herself. Amadou measured the change in miles, not walked. He had saved for a smuggler's fee and rehearsed the lies he would tell to get through the checkpoints. He had imagined salt air and fear and the kind of silence that only boats hear. Now he rose before the sun to count the moisture under straw with a cheap sensor that beeped an honest answer. He learned to test pH with a strip that bloomed color like a righteous bruise. He taught other young men how to lay grids straight and true, and when he spoke about the future, he pointed at the ground, not the horizon. The pilot expanded. The government promised to scale the method beyond demonstration into doctrine. They spoke in numbers that sounded like music, tens of thousands of hectares reclaimed, 2 to 3 million tons of grain added in a country that knew the taste of hunger too well. Skeptics cleared their throats. Would there be enough fish waste each year? Could straw be gathered without stripping fields of cover? What about water? Would success drink the aquifers dry? The questions were not enemies. They were the scaffolding of a durable victory. Engineers talked of micro dams and infiltration trenches, of shaded storage for biomass, of co-ops that could move material without moving power away from the villages that made it valuable. Crowds came to see. Delegations arrived quietly from neighbors who understood the grammar of sand. Journalists took photographs that tried and failed to capture the sound the fields made now that they were alive. In the city, the story acquired a name, the resurrection of soil, and with the name came a humility. Nobody pretended this was easy or quick or free of risk, but nobody could say any longer that it was impossible. What mattered most beneath the metrics and meetings was a feeling that spread faster than any rumor. The sensation, unfamiliar and therefore precious, that effort could be measured in more than exhaustion, that tomorrow could be coaxed into better behavior. A farmer's back bent the same way it always had, but the harvest answered differently. Children learned that the wind did not only bring dust. Sometimes it brought the smell of rain trapped in straw. Some evenings, when the light went low and the fields looked like a green thought laid over a gold memory, you could see the future in the simplest of things. A line of stones marking a plot, a boy running water between his hands, a woman adding a pinch of salt to a pot that would not run out before the stories did. If the desert is patient, the people would have to be more patient still. If the desert is vast, they would have to be precise. And if the world had already written the ending to this story, well, they were writing a new paragraph anyway. The photographs reached the capital before the grain did. Headlines shouted softly, the way good news always sounds in places trained by bad news. On radio call-in shows, voices broke mid-sentence when farmers tried to describe the first time they lifted soil that was black enough to hold a thumbprint. People called the method many things, some practical, some poetic. The phrase that stuck was the simplest: living soil. In a northern square, under a sun that looked expensive and unforgiving, the president held up a clump of earth damp enough to shine. He did not list his titles. He did not promise miracles. He simply said, "This is what victory feels like." And the square answered with a sound that made birds scatter from roofs. Later, someone would paint that moment on a wall. A hand, a darkness of soil, a small boy on his father's shoulders squinting into a future he could almost see. The leak landed like a stone thrown into a basin without water. A memorandum, dry as paper, sharp as a knife, outlined a plan that would turn a people's method into a product. $200 million for roads and storage in exchange for 2 decades of control over the very materials that made the miracle. Fish waste, no longer waste at all. Straw, no longer humble, both to be managed by companies whose names were hard to pronounce in the villages that would depend on them. It was the old story with new characters, and everyone knew the ending too well. The city filled with cardboard and courage. Our soil, our sovereignty, was scrawled in paint that ran in the heat. Women marched in straw hats meant for work, not demonstration. Men who had not been to the capital since the last time they had to complain about the price of corn walked with their heads level and their mouths closed in a line that said everything out loud. At intersections, taxi drivers honked not in anger but in time. "No one wants to die for straw and fish," a foreign columnist wrote with gentle contempt. They did not understand. People will live for straw and fish when straw and fish become food and power. The president did not send a spokesman. He sent himself. On television, he did not perform anger. He performed refusal. "The soil will not be mortgaged," he said, and the country exhaled like a bellows. A decree followed. No exclusivity, 80% local control. Foreign firms welcome to bring technology, not chains. The language was careful, which is to say it was serious. The decree did not guarantee perfection, it guaranteed a fight. The fight arrived from abroad, as fights often do, dressed as concern. Reports warned that burying too much biomass could foul water tables. Op-eds compared the method to eating sugar, sweet now, sick later. Some of the worries were genuine. Ecosystems break when they are pushed without thought. Scientists at home answered with plans to monitor, to rotate, to test. They talked about aquaculture to replenish fish stocks, about leaving straw on some fields to protect against erosion, about pairing ponds with check dams so that rain would not be wasted in celebration. Delegations from neighboring countries came and did not hold press conferences. They walked the straw grids with their shoes in their hands to feel the cooling under their feet. They listened to farmers translate the method into the dialect of each valley. They asked about mistakes and were told, plainly, where the compost had gone hot, where the straw had blown loose, where the trees had needed shade. A journalist from across a border wrote a line that people repeated because it honored them. They are not promising miracles. They are delivering maintenance. Investors circled as predictably as vultures and, like vultures, performed a necessary function if you keep an eye on them. A Russian group offered drying technology that could turn waste into commodity. A Chinese company proposed a straw bank, a phrase so absurd it swung back to genius, where farmers could deposit stocks after harvest and withdraw either cash or credit for tools. Western firms tethered to empires of fertilizer hired publicists to call the method primitive. The farmers did not answer. They were busy. Inside the country, the argument took a shape the press could not easily print. Triumph braided with dread. If the method failed, they would be accused of believing in fairy tales. If it succeeded too well, they risked becoming tenants to their own invention. The only way through was ownership, and ownership is a choreography. Cooperatives that are transparent enough to be trusted and tough enough to bargain. Local councils that speak for farmers, not to them. Ministries that remember they serve soil, not signatures. In the nights after the decree, when the capital was quiet except for generators and the slow applause of palm leaves, people discovered a new kind of insomnia. Some could not sleep because they were imagining how many hectares the co-op could handle if everyone brought straw on time. Some lay awake and counted trucks, how many, how often, what roads. Some pictured a contract being slid across a table in a country they would never see, and a pen they did not own hovering over a line drawn to look harmless. At the edge of one village, a group of boys took turns lifting and lowering a single sapling to feel how the roots resisted. "That's how we have to be," one of them said, and the others nodded, pretending to understand, actually understanding. When the wind picked up, they put the sapling back in and packed the earth with their heels. They did not look up to see if anyone was watching. They did not need to. The desert was watching. The desert always watches. It does not admire your plans, it tests them. If the rains had answered yes to the question of whether the land could be revived, politics now asked whether the revival could be kept. The answer would not come in a headline or a speech. It would come in audits that did not flinch, in contracts that expired before the people did, in the patience to plant trees whose shade would not be useful until your children learned to read under them. The climax of a story about soil is never a single moment. It is 1,000 small refusals to give the ground back. The miracle of soil did not remain in laboratories or on government charts. It entered kitchens, schools, and the rhythm of daily life. Entire communities that once measured time by hunger began to measure it by planting seasons again. The first sign was migration in reverse. Families that had left returned to their villages. Empty compounds echoed once more with the sound of pestles pounding grain. Roofs were repaired. Wells were cleared. It was not nostalgia, it was survival made attractive again. Women took the lead in many places. They organized nurseries for seedlings, planting acacia, moringa, and baobab in the protective grid of straw. They formed cooperatives to process maize into flour, selling it in markets that once traded only in scarcity. With their earnings, they bought soap, cloth, and school fees. Dignity was no longer an abstract noun. It was visible in a child wearing shoes to class, in a mother carrying a ledger instead of only a water pot. Youth, long restless and drifting, found new purpose. They formed groups that neighbors called green brigades. These teams dug trenches, laid straw in patterns, measured moisture with donated sensors, and reported conditions on mobile apps designed in the capital. For the first time, young men were paid not for leaving but for staying. One teenager who had considered joining a militia now spent his days teaching neighbors how to arrange straw squares to trap water. "Before, I thought my strength was only for fighting," he said. "Now I see it is for planting." Teachers noticed the difference first in silence. Students who once whispered of hunger during lessons now listened longer. They had eaten. They had energy to write. Schools began serving simple meals made from surplus maize. Attendance rose. Some villages reopened classrooms that had been shuttered for lack of children. The transformation was not just in the fields, it was in the minds of the next generation, learning on full stomachs. The social fabric mended where it had torn. In the north, where armed groups had long exploited desperation, recruitment dwindled. Farmers who had fields to defend no longer abandoned villages at the first gunshot. Cooperation replaced suspicion. Neighbors worked together to lay straw and share ponds. One elder said, "When the land is alive, we are alive with it. You cannot fight a man who is planting next to you." Security, it turned out, could grow from the soil. The government moved quickly to institutionalize success. It launched the National Bank of Fish and Straw, a system of collection centers spread across provinces. Fishermen delivered waste from reservoirs and lakes, earning vouchers redeemable for grain or cash. Farmers deposited straw after harvest and received credits for seeds or tools. What had once been discarded was now currency. People joked, "We deposit straw, we withdraw bread." Others called it brown gold. President Traoré's image changed in the public imagination. He was no longer just a young officer who seized power. He became the leader who walked barefoot through straw grids, sleeves rolled up, carrying a hoe alongside villagers. Murals painted him with a shovel in one hand and a child's hand in the other. On local radio, songs praised not only him but the collective effort, fish and straw, soil and hope, we rise together. Politically, the effect was profound. Burkina Faso had long lived under the shadow of coups and suspicion toward the state. Now, for the first time in years, citizens saw government officials as allies rather than distant rulers. Ministers traveled to villages not with armed escorts but with seedlings and training manuals. Mayors were judged not by promises but by how many hectares of living soil they had helped reclaim. Opposition parties struggled to attack a program that filled granaries and restored pride. Some adopted the same language: resilience, sovereignty, soil revival, blurring traditional political lines. Not all voices were convinced. Intellectuals in Ouagadougou warned against celebrating too soon. They pointed out that soil fertility could decline after several cycles if not carefully managed. They questioned whether enough fish waste could be gathered each year without depleting aquatic ecosystems. Hydrologists worried about groundwater use. These warnings were serious, and the government responded by funding studies, pilot projects in aquaculture, and new biomass alternatives. Yet in the villages, people measured reality differently. They saw more meals, more grain, more laughter. The statistics of survival were in their stomachs, not just in reports. The symbolism grew stronger than any policy paper. Straw bundles became emblems painted on walls and carried in festivals. Children marched with handfuls of seedlings as if they were flags. The nation found a narrative it had been missing. Not one of victimhood, but of resistance and rebirth. Dignity returned, not as a promise, but as a practice. The changes touched even the most fragile parts of society. In villages where women once felt powerless, they now held leadership roles in cooperatives. In regions where young men had once carried guns, they now carried seedlings. Families who once survived on the edge of migration began to imagine building futures at home. For the first time in decades, a generation was growing up not with memories of famine alone, but with stories of revival. Of course, challenges remained. The desert did not surrender. Each season tested the method. Some straw grids blew away in violent storms. Some ponds dried faster than expected. Some villages argued over distribution of fish waste. The miracle was not perfect. It was work, constant and stubborn. Yet even in failure, there was persistence. "We try again," a farmer said after relaying a straw plot destroyed by wind. "The desert does not rest." Why should we? In the end, the soil revival was not only an agricultural policy, it became a civil religion, a covenant between people and land. It gave the government legitimacy rooted not in slogans or soldiers, but in results. It gave citizens a sense of agency that they could change their fate with their own hands. And it gave the world a rare sight, a nation finding stability not through guns or gold, but through the quiet power of soil. When dusk settled over the fields and the wind carried the scent of green where once it carried only dust, people knew this was more than survival. It was belonging. They were no longer drifting at the mercy of the desert. They were rooted. When the first harvest came in, the images could no longer be contained within Burkina Faso. Photographs of green maize standing tall against golden dunes traveled across borders, landing on the screens of diplomats, journalists, and ordinary people who had long written the Sahel off as hopeless. In Africa, the reaction was immediate and emotional. Newspapers in Mali and Niger ran headlines asking, "If Burkina Faso can do this, what excuse do we have?" Farmers in northern Ghana organized delegations to visit the pilot sites. Kenyan commentators praised the initiative as proof that Africa's survival would come not from imported technologies, but from rediscovered wisdom. For many, Burkina Faso had become not just a neighbor, but an example, showing that resilience could be built with hands and waste, not only with billions of foreign dollars. International organizations began to respond as well. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations praised the method as low-cost and highly adaptable to dry lands. UNICEF projected that if scaled nationwide, child malnutrition in Burkina Faso could fall by more than a third within 5 years. African think tanks published studies calling the experiment a model of indigenous innovation. For a region long described in reports as a zone of failure, such recognition felt revolutionary. But not everyone was applauding. In Brussels and Washington, agricultural lobbies raised alarms. Fertilizer corporations circulated reports warning that widespread adoption of the fish and straw method could slash Africa's demand for chemical imports by billions each year. One European executive wrote bluntly in a leaked memo, "If this spreads, our business model collapses." American analysts dismissed the program as a sugar rush for the soil, predicting that fertility would fade after a few cycles. Other powers, however, saw opportunity. China praised the project as an example of South-South resilience and proposed technical cooperation from solar pumps to aquaculture expansion. Russian companies offered to help preserve fish waste with drying facilities and hinted at joint ventures in biomass logistics. What once looked like a desperate local experiment was suddenly a contested frontier in global geopolitics. Perhaps the most unexpected reaction came from the African diaspora. Across Black America, activists and influencers began sharing stories of President Ibrahim Traoré. Comment sections filled with blessings. "God bless this young leader. Africa is rising." Videos of children carrying straw bundles and farmers holding handfuls of black soil went viral, igniting a sense of pride that crossed oceans. Some even called Traoré a new symbol of Pan-African hope, arguing that his struggle mirrored historic fights for dignity and self-reliance. Between admiration and resistance, one truth became clear. Burkina Faso's soil revival was no longer a domestic issue. It had become a mirror the world could not avoid.